Today I ask a political question and a religious question. I ask a political and a religious question, well, at the same time. It's kind of like the old advertising slogan for Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. You know, two great tastes that taste great together. Except that in this case, it's not two great tastes. It's two terrible tastes, and they don't combine to anything special. Okay, and that's on the way to answering the question, is Trumpism a cult?
Welcome to the Sky Pilot podcast that explores questions of faith, spirituality, and religion. I'm Dan Matthews, and I don't have all the answers, but I do enjoy the questions. Welcome to the podcast where every question is an invitation into a spiritual quest, and you're invited along for the journey.
Hi, I'm Dan, this is Quark, and we're your co-pilots for today's spiritual quest and rather interesting journey. Welcome aboard. Okay, before we get started, let me answer a couple of likely questions. I'm going to use the word cult in a very specific way as a subset of the larger category of religion. Now, there are those who would assert that all religions are cults. And I know there are even people, scholars, who study religion who might agree with that particular definition. So I want to be clear, I'm not using the scholarly definition of a group that has, say, cultic practices, meaning shared rituals, sacred space, sacred objects, sacred texts, and such. When I use the word cult, I'm using it in a more common, modern, and admittedly negative definition. When I use the word, I'm thinking of, well, I think often of the psychologist I met decades ago who specialized in helping people recover and heal after they had been a member of a cult. And it's that kind of cult that I'm talking about.
Don't you think a bit more definition is necessary?
Yeah, I do. And we're going to get there. I promise. So that leads us to another question. Why ask this question? Why ask it here? Well, as I've been watching and studying the ways and methods of Donald Trump, it dawned on me that there's an almost religious aspect to those who follow him. And after having that thought, I suddenly asked myself, hey, is this a cult and I'm just not recognizing it for what it is? Now, some will say again, well, all religions are cults because all religions are oppressive and none of them are good. Look, if that is your stance, feel free to keep listening, watching. Just know that we're not going to agree on that point. You can certainly name places, times, and groups who, in the name of their religion, did, bad things. But that isn't the rule in any absolute or total sense. There are also plenty of people like Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Desmond Tutu, Albert Schweitzer, Florence Nightingale, and the list goes on and on and on of people who made the world a better place, a much better place, and not in spite of their faith and religion, but directly because of it. But as I said, religion can be expressed in negative ways as well. And one such way is a cult. Probably the most famous cult that I can think of was the People's Temple. They were led by Jim Jones, who took his cult and moved to Guyana. And ultimately that led to the murder-suicide of over 900 members of the cult in that country. Now, not all cults are headed towards murder-suicide, but there are some common traits that most cults share.
Oh, good. And these are?
Good. So let's talk about that. What is it that defines a cult? And do those elements that cults share fit when talking about Donald Trump and his followers? And I should say up front, this is not a situation where I have decided that the answer is yes. Instead, I've decided to ask the question and see where the research leads me. So this video is not so much an effort to prove something that I've already decided is true, as it is an invitation to join me on an investigative journey. I am literally writing this podcast as I do the research. Now, I will insert at this particular point, since the research is done as I'm recording and the podcast has been written, this led me someplace I did not expect. So stick around. Let's take a look at what are considered to be the defining characteristics of a cult. Let's look at the generally agreed upon elements and see if they fit Donald Trump and his followers. See if that movement, Trumpism, fits the description of a cult. The first and primary characteristic I found in my research is that cults are typically led by a charismatic leader who is seen as often infallible or omniscient or even sometimes divine. The leader often exerts total control over the group and demands absolute loyalty and obedience. So this one is a bit of a softball question. Is Donald Trump a charismatic leader who demands loyalty and is seen by his followers as almost infallible?
I'd call that a big yes.
Yeah, I agree. I will put that one in a solid yes category. Okay, second element. Cults foster a strong distinction between insiders, meaning members of the cult, and outsiders, meaning everyone else. And this mentality often leads to paranoia, fear, and distrust of the outside world. And I don't think I need to go into a lot more detail. Again, I think it's very clear across the board that pretty well describes Trumpism. Third, members are often exploited financially, emotionally, or physically. And this can include demanding large or consistent, constant donations, free labor, or even abusive practices, all justified as serving the group's higher purpose. Well, I don't know about physical abuse, but there's no doubt that Trumpism seeks to financially exploit its followers for the benefit of its leaders, and I would say raising money nonstop to make America great again and then using that money for your legal fees or personal expenses, well, for me, falls into that category. So, yeah, another yes. Okay, next, cults often operate with a lack of transparency about their true intentions, finances, or the full scope of their beliefs and practices, particularly to outsiders, new members, and sometimes to even those within. Again, I would say that this is a strong yes in the case of Trumpism and Donald Trump and his followers.
Okay, can I say there isn't anything surprising here, but all of these seem to be, well, just a bit too easy.
Yeah, well said, and I absolutely agree, but things are about to change. So next, cults are traditionally known for the use of brainwashing or mind control techniques. Okay, this one, yeah, maybe not so much. Does he demand allegiance? Well, yeah, he does. But does he use classic brainwashing techniques? Are there Trump training camps around the nation that people are taken away to and indoctrinated to make them more a part of the group? Are people asked to leave their homes and families to follow Donald Trump? No, not really. For cults, brainwashing wouldn't even be possible if it weren't for isolation. Cults often isolate their members from the outside world, including family and friends, and this isolation reinforces the dependence on the group and the leader, and it makes it easier to control members. Again, isolation really isn't a tool of Trumpism. Another part of this that is typical of cults is that there isn't an easy exit. Cults are hard to leave, sometimes literally, physically hard to leave because they've isolated you in a remote location and you would have to escape while they weren't looking. And as much as I don't agree with Donald Trump, and I think you've probably figured that out, I don't think this one describes his relationship with his followers either. So no to brainwashing, no to isolation, no to hard to escape, no to asking people to leave their family.
So maybe this cult thing is a dead end after all.
Yeah, so I got to this point of my research, and I'll have to admit, I was puzzled. It had seemed like such a likely fit. So I took several days trying to sort this out. And there are elements of a cult that fit perfectly, as you saw at the beginning, but others just, well, if I'm honest, others just don't seem to fit at all. So as I began to do more research, I started looking for a new word, perhaps a more specific type of cult or religious formation that would, well, more accurately describe the phenomenon of Trumpism. And as I did so, I came across a different idea. And it falls more into the political arena than it does into the religious. It has some overlap with the definition of cult, but I think there are more elements that fit with this new word than with cult. First, a confession. I resisted it for quite a while in my research because it is a term that, well, the political left uses sometimes to just tag on someone who they don't like, to mean someone who's more conservative than they are. You know, kind of like the political right uses the word socialist or communist, which simply means someone more liberal than I am, and I want to tag them with a word that I think is terrible and will mar them by my describing them as a liberal or a communist. And the word I'm talking about is fascism. Calling someone a fascist or even a Nazi seems to me like a lazy, non-thinking, political, knee-jerk response very often. But I want to be clear at this point, I'm not saying that Donald Trump is a fascist. Well, he might be. He might not be. I'm not inside his head to know what his motivation and thoughts are. And I have to say, I'm really glad I'm not. The question I want to ask is, what is fascism as it is defined by those who study it, not by me, and how much does that definition fit Donald Trump's political movement as we observe it today? So for the purpose of this question, I'm more interested in the movement than I am his personal motivation. Hence the question about Trumpism, not Donald Trump. So to be honest about my research and transparent about my methodology, and so that I'm not creating the definition, I went to ChatGPT and asked for the generally agreed upon defining characteristics of a fascist movement as they strive for power but aren't currently in control. Again, the definition I looked for are the characteristics of a fascist movement before it comes to full power. How would you recognize a fascist movement as it is developing? That's the question. Well, again, first, there is a charismatic leader, a cult of personality.
Well, there is some overlap. We've already run into the word cult right there.
Indeed. The movement is often centered around a charismatic leader who is portrayed as the savior of the nation. This leader is seen as the embodiment of the will of the people and is often given almost near mythical status.
I think I am a friend of mine said, you have to be the most perfect person.
And there is a direct appeal, meaning the leader often bypasses traditional political structures, instead using mass rallies, media, and propaganda to speak directly to the people, fostering a personal connection with the masses he hopes to lead. The leader of a growing fascist movement normally has a strong element of two things in his message. And by the way, there are no examples that I could find of a female fascist leaders. There are female fascists, I'm not saying that, but female fascist leaders, meaning people who have risen up within their country, started the movement themselves, and are the leader of that movement, seem to be always men.
Oh. That's interesting. Perhaps not terribly surprising, but interesting nonetheless.
Yeah. Anyway, the leader of a fascist movement normally has a strong element of two things in his message. First, he preaches a hyper-populist nationalism. And this one is key and may be familiar to you when you start thinking about Trump and his speeches. The second key element to the rhetoric coming from a leader of a fascist movement is that the leader positions himself as the champion of the common people over and against the elites, the political elites, the academic elites. The fascist movement is almost always promising to rescue the people from oppression they are supposedly suffering at the hands of these elites.
Okay, that sounds rather familiar too.
Yeah.
You ever notice they always call the other side, and they do this up, the elite. The elite. Why are they elite? I have a much better apartment than they do.
Next, they often use anti-democratic rhetoric. Again, the movement openly criticizes democratic institutions, portraying them as weak or corrupt or ineffective. It advocates for a more authoritarian or centralized form of government as a solution to what it sees as the national problems. This is most often paired with a call for unity and order, but a very specific meaning to those two words. Fascist movements emphasize the need for strong, centralized authority to restore national greatness, often calling for an end to political pluralism and an end to political dissent. Next, there is normally the identification of an enemy group and the attempt to scapegoat them. The movement typically identifies specific groups as enemies, again, as scapegoats. Think ethnic minorities, immigrants, communists, liberals. These groups are blamed for the nation's problems and portrayed as threats to that national unity they're trying to create. There's also a strong element of conspiratorial thinking in a growing fascist movement. Fascist movements often propagate conspiracy theories, suggesting that the nation is under threat from hidden forces within or foreign external plots.
Here's my plan to dismantle the deep state and reclaim our democracy from Washington corruption once and for all.
One of the types of propaganda, and propaganda in all its forms tend to be very popular with growing fascist movements, but one that is typical is that fascists frequently invoke a glorified version of the past, suggesting that the nation was once great and can be great again under their leadership.
Oh, like make America great again?
The ideology of a nascent fascist movement can be surprisingly fluid because they are often more allegiant to their charismatic leader than any particular political doctrine. But what is not wavering is the commitment to follow the leader and adhere rigidly to core themes such as nationalism, authoritarianism, anti-communism, fear of subversive plots, anti-elite rhetoric, a desire to sidestep often democratic processes to bring about their goals, and often using an ethnic group as the source of danger for the nation. Does all of that sound familiar? Now, do I think Trump is the leader of a potentially fascist movement? Yeah, I do. That isn't where this episode started, but once I followed the research I was doing, I concluded that it describes Trumpism pretty darn accurately. Frighteningly accurately. So you tell me, what do you think? And that's all for today.
Oh, before we go, just a quick question. Isn't this podcast supposed to be about faith, spirituality, and religion, not fascism?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. Yes, once my research led me in a new direction, meaning fascism, I thought about scrapping the entire episode, but ultimately, and obviously, I decided not to. First, because I started with what was a genuine religious question. Is Trumpism a cult? My second reason for continuing is that the podcast here isn't just to focus on positive things. Sometimes there are aspects of religion, faith, spirituality, and even life that we need to be willing to talk about, the negative as well as the positive. And finally, I looked at what defines a growing fascist movement within a country, and at times it looks pretty darn religious. In a decidedly negative way, but religious nonetheless. And there are even many people within Trumpism who genuinely believe that Donald Trump is sent by God to deliver America. Matter of fact, you will often see them draw kind of frightening parallels between Donald Trump and Jesus Christ as saviors. So there is a decided element within Trumpism that seems to be very religious. Trump is here, sent by God, they believe. So I decided to stay the course and share my research. Hey, thanks for watching all the way to the end. If you found this topic important, helpful, thought-provoking, or just interesting, and if you'd like to use your voice to make a difference and spread the news, then like, subscribe, even more important, leave a comment. Those all go a long way towards helping content like this get to people who would also like to see it. You're part of this channel. Use your voice to help it grow, please. And on your spiritual journey, may you ask questions, seek answers, and boldly go wherever the quest takes you.
Thanks for joining us here today and being part of the Sky Pilot Faith Quest community. This is a great place to ask questions you wouldn't feel comfortable or safe asking in other places. And remember, the sign of a strong faith, solid religion, or healthy spiritual journey is not certainty, but that you keep asking questions.